Sanctuary Cove was the sort of place people described in lowered voices, as if speaking too loudly might disturb its beauty. It lay folded between a silver stretch of water and a belt of ancient mangroves, where the sea slid into private marinas and the sun seemed to linger a little longer than it did anywhere else. Palm trees lined immaculate avenues so wide and clean they looked painted on. Villas with white columns and glass walls sat behind hedges trimmed into impossible geometry. At dusk, when the sky turned peach and violet over the harbor, the whole community shimmered like a jewel someone had dropped and never bothered to retrieve. To outsiders, Sanctuary Cove was wealth made visible. To the people who lived there, it was simply home. The residents were elegant in the way expensive things often are, discreet, polished, and difficult to read. There was Helena Vale, who owned half a chain of luxury resorts and wore pearls even to breakfast. There was Julian Mercer, a private equity man with a tan that looked medically administered and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. There was the Ormond family, old money so old it had started to look like weathered stone. And there was Mara Quinn, widow, philanthropist, and the newest arrival among them, who had bought her estate not with inherited wealth, but with the proceeds from selling a software company she had built from nothing. People like to think money made everyone shallow. Sanctuary Cove proved the opposite. It merely gave them more room to hide their secrets. Mara learned this quickly. She had arrived in late summer, moving into a house at the far end of Coraline Drive, a property with a floating staircase, a pool that ran flush to the edge of the terrace, and a dock large enough for a yacht she did not own and had no intention of buying. She told herself she wanted peace after her husband Daniel's death. The lawyers had called it grief therapy in practical terms, a change of scenery, a cleaner sky, a new language of silence. What she did not tell anyone was that Daniel had left behind a sealed envelope. Inside it was a single handwritten sentence. "If anything happens to me, go to Sanctuary Cove. Trust no one there except the woman with the scar." She had stared at those words for days before finally deciding that absurd instructions were often the ones that mattered most. So she came. 3 months later, standing on her balcony overlooking the marina as evening settled across the water, she watched the lights rise one by one like stars being switched on by hand. Across the channel, Blackthorn House had gone dark. The mansion belonged to Victor Hales, a billionaire whose influence stretched across almost every aspect of Sanctuary Cove. He donated generously, entertained lavishly, and seemed to own half the community without ever saying so aloud. Its darkness should not have mattered, yet something about it unsettled her. Then her phone rang. The caller was a local number. "Mrs. Quinn?" "Yes." "You don't know me, but you need to come to the marina, right now." "Who is this?" "My name is Lena." A pause. "I'm the woman with the scar." Mara didn't hesitate. "I'm coming." At the marina, she met Lena exactly as Daniel had described her, a composed woman with a pale crescent-shaped scar crossing the inside of her wrist. Lena handed her a plain folder. Inside were photographs, invoices, maps, emails, evidence that Sanctuary Cove concealed far more than luxury homes and expensive yachts. Hidden companies, offshore trusts, money that flowed through shell corporations, Daniel had known, perhaps for years. Before Mara could fully understand what she was seeing, another figure appeared, Julian Mercer. His arrival felt almost casual. It wasn't. Within moments, the conversation fractured into accusations, half-truths, and warnings. Then, someone raised a gun. The first shot shattered the silence over the water. Chaos erupted. Bullets splintered timber. People ran. Lena shoved Mara aside as another round struck the dock. Julian dragged her toward a waiting launch. They escaped into the darkness while gunfire chased them across the harbor. The lights of Sanctuary Cove glittered behind them, beautiful and indifferent. Only when they were safely away did Mara finally find enough breath to ask the question that had been building since Daniel's note. "What is really happening here?" Julian looked back toward the glowing shoreline. His answer changed everything. Because Sanctuary Cove was never really built as a resort community. The launch cut through the dark water, leaving Sanctuary Cove glowing behind them like a city that had forgotten how to sleep. For several long moments, neither Mara nor Julian spoke. The gunfire had faded into the distance, replaced by the steady hum of the engine and the soft slap of waves against the hull. Mara clutched the folder against her chest. "You knew," she finally said. Julian didn't deny it. "Not all of it." "That's convenient. It's not a defense." "No." He kept his eyes on the water. Your husband contacted me 2 weeks before he died. Mara stared at him. What? He believed someone in Sanctuary Cove was preparing to kill him. He asked for help getting evidence out. And you never told me? I didn't know where you were. That's a lie. Julian glanced at her. I knew where you were, I just wasn't sure whether I could trust you. His house stood hidden beyond a quiet inlet, surrounded by ironwood trees and almost invisible from the water. Inside, everything reflected quiet wealth. Clean lines, modern art, shelves filled with first editions, nothing personal. Nothing that revealed who Julian Mercer really was. He locked the doors and drew the curtains before turning back to Mara. I need the folder. No. If someone is looking for it, the safest place is with me. You expect me to believe that after tonight? I expect you to believe that Victor Hales will stop at nothing to get it back. Mara frowned. Why? Julian looked at her for a long moment. Then he spoke. Because Sanctuary Cove was never really built as a resort community. Silence settled between them. What does that mean? It was built around something. What? A vault. Mara almost laughed. A vault? A secure archive. Decades ago, before any of the luxury homes existed, this land was controlled by a private consortium. They built tunnels beneath the cove to store records, bearer instruments, confidential agreements, anything too valuable or too dangerous to leave inside a bank. And when Sanctuary Cove was developed, the developers inherited everything beneath it. Before Mara could ask another question, every light in the house went out, not just inside. Across the entire cove. The waterfront disappeared into darkness. Outside, villas, marinas, and landscaped streets vanished one by one until only the moon reflected across the water. Then, alarms began screaming. Julian reacted instantly. Stay here. Not a chance. The front window exploded inward. Glass showered across the floor as a small metal device rolled into the room, whining softly. Julian's face changed. Get down! The flash grenade detonated. White light. Smoke. The room disappeared into chaos. Someone shouted. Hands grabbed at Mara through the smoke. She kicked free. A familiar voice called out. She has the folder! Then another voice. Lena! Out of the haze emerged the woman with the scar, one arm bleeding. This way! She pulled Mara through a narrow hallway and down a concealed staircase. Julian followed close behind. The stairwell opened into what looked like a wine cellar. At the far end, a seam appeared in the stone floor. Julian pressed his hand against a hidden reader. With a deep mechanical groan, the floor split apart. A staircase descended into darkness. Amber lights flickered to life below. What is this place? Mara whispered. Julian looked down into the hidden passage. The part of Sanctuary Cove no one was ever supposed to find. They descended. The air grew cooler. Concrete gave way to stone. The tunnel stretched beneath the cove, branching into corridors lined with reinforced chambers and aging brass plaques. It felt less like a bunker than a forgotten underground city. They entered the first archive. Steel cabinets stretched in every direction. Shelves overflowed with deeds, passports, ledgers, cassette tapes, and sealed hard drives. Generations of wealth. Generations of secrets. Mara slowly turned in disbelief. This is impossible. Lena shook her head. No. She pointed toward the center of the room. Someone had already been there. Folders lay open, documents scattered, drawers forced apart. Julian's expression hardened. Victor. No, Lena replied. He'd have left it looking perfect. Mara lifted one of the documents. It mapped companies, trusts, charities, and political figures connected through a web of shell corporations. One code appeared again and again. Cove. Origin. Then she saw it. A signature. Daniel Quinn. Her knees weakened. He signed these. Julian gently took the page. He wasn't part of it. Mara looked at him. He signed as a witness. Everything she thought she knew about Daniel shifted. He wasn't helping them. Julian nodded. He was documenting them. Before Mara could speak again, footsteps echoed through the tunnel. Slow, measured, confident. A voice emerged from the darkness. Julian. If you're down there, bring the woman forward. We can settle this without making a mess. Victor Hales stepped into the amber light, immaculately dressed, calm, completely in control. Behind him stood armed security officers. Victor smiled politely. Mrs. Quinn? Welcome to Sanctuary Cove. Before anyone could move, another voice echoed from the tunnel entrance. A woman's voice. Elegant. Cold. I think you've welcomed her long enough. Every head turned. Helena Vale stepped from the shadows. She wore black silk and an expression that suggested she had waited years for this moment. Victor's smile disappeared. What did you do? Helena returned the question with one of her own. What makes you think Isabel was the only one who kept copies? The tunnel fell silent. Then gunfire erupted from somewhere above. Concrete dust rained from the ceiling. Emergency lights flashed crimson. 2 masked figures dropped through the opening into the chamber. The first pulled back her hood. Lena's breath caught. Isabel! Victor Hales went completely pale. The chamber fell silent. Victor Hales stared at the young woman standing beneath the broken ceiling. For the first time since Mara had met him, the billionaire looked genuinely shaken. Lena's voice barely escaped above a whisper. Isabel. The young woman stepped forward. Years of hiding had hardened her expression, but beneath the determination, Mara caught a glimpse of exhaustion. Victor found his voice. You were supposed to be dead. I know, Isabel replied calmly. You arranged the funeral beautifully. Beside her stood another figure. An older man, broad-shouldered, weathered. Mara recognized him instantly. She had seen his face in newspapers years ago. He was supposed to have died. Julian stared in disbelief. You're alive. For now. The older man gave a brief nod. We can discuss miracles later. Victor's security team raised their weapons. Helena Vale quietly stepped back into the shadows. Isabel crossed directly to the center table. She placed a waterproof data drive onto the scattered documents. Everything is here. Victor's expression darkened. I spent years making sure those records disappeared. And I spent years making copies. Mara looked between them. Daniel had known. He had known far more than she had ever imagined. She turned toward Isabel. Daniel helped hide you. A flicker of sadness crossed Isabel's face. Yes, he knew all of this. Yes. Did he know he was going to die? Isabel hesitated. She never answered. She didn't need to. The silence said everything. Then the tunnel lights failed. Darkness swallowed the chamber. Emergency strobes erupted in violent flashes of red. Gunfire exploded from every direction. Victor shouted orders. Security officers surged forward. Helena disappeared into another passage. Julian grabbed the data drive. Move! Mara ran. The tunnel twisted beneath the cove. Concrete gave way to stone. Stone gave way to flooded passageways. Behind them came shouts, footsteps. Gunfire. The entire underground city had come alive. They emerged into a chamber filled ankle-deep with seawater. Ahead lay an opening to the night. Hidden beneath the shoreline sat an old launch bay. Julian was already pulling a boat free. Lena covered the rear. The older man fired back at the pursuing guards. Mara stumbled aboard. Isabel thrust a waterproof case into her hands. Don't lose it. The engine roared. Bullets skipped across the water as the launch tore away from the hidden harbor. Victor appeared at the top of the steps. Gone was the calm billionaire. Gone was the polished public figure. Only fury remained. Behind him stood Helena Vale. She watched everything unfold with the faintest smile. The cove slowly came back to life. Lights flickered on. Helicopters approached from the mainland. Sirens echoed across the harbor. Police boats cut through the water. For the first time in decades, Sanctuary Cove could no longer hide behind perfection. Julian guided the launch into a quiet inlet hidden among dense mangroves. No one spoke. Mara finally looked down at the waterproof case Isabel had given her. Inside were documents, hard drives, recordings, ledgers, evidence capable of destroying fortunes. Tucked inside one pocket lay a folded handwritten letter. Daniel's handwriting. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. Mara, if you're reading this, then Sanctuary Cove has done what it always does to truth. It has tried to bury it. I'm sorry I brought you into this. I wanted to keep you safe. I failed. There is one thing you must know. I did not come to Sanctuary Cove to expose them. I came because I discovered your husband's death was not the first attempt on your life. I had to know why. I had to know who you really were. Forgive me for keeping that from you. Forgive me if you can, for loving you enough to lie. Daniel Mara read the letter again. Then again. The words refused to make sense. She looked up. My husband. Wasn't my husband. Lena lowered her eyes. No. The world shifted beneath Mara. Every memory, every certainty, every piece of her life suddenly felt borrowed. She turned toward Isabel. What does that mean? Isabel's answer came quietly. It means you were hidden. Hidden from who? A long silence. Then, from us. And from him. Mara stared. Who am I? Isabel took a slow breath. Her voice almost broke. Your real name is Eleanor Vale. The words echoed through the mangroves. Vale. Helena's name. Victor's world. An entire lifetime built upon a lie. Daniel's letter slipped from Mara's fingers. It drifted silently into the black water. She reached for it. Too late. It disappeared beneath the surface. Julian stepped forward. We should get you somewhere safe. Mara laughed, a hollow, exhausted laugh. Safe? She looked back across the water. Police helicopters circled above Sanctuary Cove. Searchlights swept across the glittering mansions. The perfect paradise was finally beginning to crack. Now she understood why. She had never been an outsider. She had always belonged there. For several moments no one spoke. The only sounds came from the distant sirens echoing across the water and the gentle drift of the launch among the mangroves. Mara stared at the black water where Daniel's letter had disappeared. Gone. Just like the life she thought she had known. Lena finally broke the silence. I'm sorry. Mara looked at her. For what? For all of it. Mara nodded slowly. I don't even know who I am anymore. Isabel stood quietly at the edge of the landing. You do. No. You know exactly who you are. Mara shook her head. I only know the name I've been living under. Eleanor Vale was only the name they buried. Julian watched the exchange without interrupting. He understood better than anyone that the greatest battles were often fought inside a person's own mind. Across the harbor, Sanctuary Cove was changing. Helicopters circled overhead. Police boats cut through the marina. Searchlights swept across immaculate mansions that had spent decades hiding behind gates, marble, and privilege. Television crews gathered beyond the security entrance. For the first time, Sanctuary Cove looked vulnerable. Victor Hales's empire was beginning to fracture. Somewhere inside Blackthorn House, investigators were uncovering decades of concealed records. Elsewhere, Helena Vale had already disappeared. She had prepared for this night long before anyone else realized it was coming. The older man who had emerged from the tunnels looked at Mara with quiet recognition. You knew me. He nodded. When you were 7. Her breath caught. My parents? He looked away. He didn't need to answer. Everything she needed to know was written in his silence. Mara stepped onto the timber landing and looked back across the water. The reflections dancing across the harbor no longer looked beautiful. They looked fragile, false, like polished glass waiting to break. She thought about Daniel, about the years he had spent protecting a truth she had never imagined, about the lies he had carried alone. He hadn't betrayed her. He had sacrificed everything to protect her. That understanding settled over her with unexpected calm. She looked down at the waterproof case still resting in her hands. Inside it lay enough evidence to expose fortunes, reputations, and an entire hidden network that had operated beneath Sanctuary Cove for generations. Victor Hales had built his empire on secrecy. Now secrecy had become his greatest weakness. Julian stepped beside her. We can leave tonight. Disappear. Start again somewhere else. Mara smiled sadly. I've been disappearing my whole life. He said nothing. She turned back toward the lights. They spent years deciding who I was. They chose my name, my past, my future. She drew a slow breath. I'm done letting other people write my story. Lena exchanged a glance with Isabel. Neither tried to stop her. Both knew the decision had already been made. Julian looked across the harbor. You know what happens if we go back? Yes. It won't be over. I know. They'll come after you. They already have. Silence settled again. Then Mara looked directly at Julian. Take me back. He frowned. Back to Blackthorn House? Back to Sanctuary Cove. She looked once more toward the glittering shoreline. The place that had once appeared perfect now looked exactly as it truly was. A paradise built upon deception. A community protected by silence. A fortune preserved through fear. Not anymore. Julian's expression softened. For the first time since they had met, he believed she understood exactly what lay ahead. He started the engine. The launch turned slowly. The bow pointed once more toward the lights of Sanctuary Cove. Behind them, the mangroves faded into darkness. Ahead, police helicopters hovered above the waterfront. Emergency lights reflected across the marina. Reporters gathered beyond the gates. Doors opened. Doors closed. Powerful people who had spent a lifetime controlling every outcome suddenly found themselves confronting the one thing they had never prepared for: the truth. Mara stood at the front of the launch. The wind caught her hair as the cove grew larger with every passing second. She no longer felt like a widow searching for answers. She no longer felt like an outsider. She no longer felt like a victim. Whatever her name had been, whatever blood ran through her veins, whoever she had once been, the next chapter of her life would be written by her. Not by Victor Hales, not by Helena Vale, not by ghosts. The launch reached open water. Beyond it, Sanctuary Cove shimmered beneath the flashing lights of helicopters and police vessels. The illusion was over. The reckoning had begun. And Sanctuary Cove, which had spent an entire lifetime hiding its rot beneath brilliance, began at last to come apart under the weight of the truth.